Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Apotheosis on in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 11, Wake Up. That night I dreamed of Haven. I was walking along a muddy path with Salas. Below, the bright sun and skies clear, the wind scattered fine snow down from the rooftops. We slipped inside the chantry alone, our bare feet quite on the stone. He led me to the dungeon, showed me the cell where I'd been prisoner. I sat beside you while you slept, studying the anchor. In the frenzied flash of a dream, I was both standing with Salas in the center of the room and also lying in the narrow cell. My right hand was chained to the floor, and my left hand splayed in his lap. His brow furrowed as he traced the flickering scar across my palm. A shimmering thread of magic twisted in the space between us, our manas pooling together as he tested me, studied me. A soldier spat at the bars, knife-eared bitch. Then we were outside again, Salas explaining how he came to join the Inquisition and how he came to stay. I watched the rifts expand and grow, resigned myself to flee, and then... It wasn't a memory, but a reliving. Standing at the rift for the first time, when Salas grabbed my hand and I felt the whole world change, shifting into place and making sense after nothing but confusion. I felt the torrent of magic explode from my palm, and the strength in Salas' grip as he held my hand in place, both of us shaking from the backlash. Then the living memory died and he was standing before me once more, on the path to his little house. I felt the whole world change, he said. I thought back to the despair that dogged my sleep in the emerald graves, the anger Salas had shown earlier in the day. Where was all this coming from? No mage steps into the fade unawares. Lucid dreaming is all that keeps any of us from possession, but now I realized that something was amiss. These weren't my memories. Some were, surely, and some mere echoes of the fade, but other details were too precise to be random and clearly not my own. The soldier who'd cursed me when I'd been unconscious, the look of the anchor from an impossible angle. I had presumed this Salas to be a composite, fragments of my own memory pieced together in the fade, but I didn't have a template for the softness in his eyes, or the gentle tremor in his voice. These were the sort of details every mage was trained to look for, the bits that didn't belong to signal a spirit in our midst. I didn't know if it were a desire demon offering a Salas more perfect than the one I knew, or a spirit of curiosity simply caught on my fixation. Whatever the case, I found that I didn't particularly care. It felt so wonderfully real. More than real, as if the Salas I knew were but a mirror's reflection and this Salas the man himself. Warmth was spreading through my veins, the air felt electric. If for one instant I could believe that the thing we had between us was real, it was worth the price. This then was how so many mages fell to possession. We didn't even put up a fight. I reached for him, winding my hand behind his neck to pull him down, my thumb behind his ear and my mouth crushed against his. Everything about it was wrong, his mouth a hard line, his body unyielding, and his head shaking. No, no. Now this was an echo of what I knew, and I was a fool to think I'd even live to see an empty fantasy before it was over. I pulled back, my right hand instinctively reaching for a staff that wasn't there. Then he rushed at me, circling me in his arms, bending me like a reed, forcing my mouth open with his tongue. He was devouring me with hot kisses and greedy hands, stealing my breath, sucking my lip. In the fractured flashes of a dream, it was as if we were making love. I could feel him move inside me, heat plunging through my core, pushing me to an orgasm as if it were as simple as scratching an itch. He wasn't real, he wasn't real, he wasn't real, but I couldn't stop. It was blinding white light at the backs of my eyes, a shiver through the heart of me, and electricity on my fingertips when I lost focus of my magic. I felt how he teetered on the edge of his climax as if it were my own. Creators, it was my own but inverted. A driving rush of pleasure crashing over us both. He bit into my ear and groaned, jerked, pressed me closer, and then suddenly tore away. We were still standing in the snow, the dreamy illusion of anything more fading away, and guilt spreading across his face. This isn't right, his words were heavy with regret. Not even here. I stumbled back. Not even here. Oh gods, oh gods, oh gods, oh gods. It was actually Salas. Chapter 12, Possession. I shot upright in my bedroll, drenched in sweat and heart racing. I clamped a hand over my mouth. Had I screamed? The air was humid and thick, muffling the soft chirrup of nugs tumbling through the underbrush. I was in the emerald graves. Panting, I tried to shake free from the confusion. Creators, it felt real. Salas felt real, the heat of his skin, the slick stop. This had to stop. However it felt, what it was impossible. Mages cannot dream walk, our minds are our own. Whether circle trained or Dalish, this was the first tenet of entering the Fade: you have no friends here. Only spirits can tempt us, or demons. Fear, like ice, crawled across my skin. Cullen once told me that he'd known the hero of Ferelden from her time in the Circle, that he'd been there the night Kinloch Hold fell, demons tormenting him with the sight of her until he couldn't recognize the woman when she stood before him. Scores of harrowed mages, good men, and women and elves among them, were given over to possession in their own tower, such was the temptation. I thought of Varric's friend Merrill, who heard a spirit in the Fade promise to restore the Eluvian. None but a Dalish could understand what it meant that Keeper Marit Hari paid the price. That's what it meant to be first. We make our choices freely, but consequences belong to the clan. Among the Dalish, Merrill's name was Harellen, traitor to our kin. I would die before the people called me such. I slipped from the blankets and through the camp, headlong into the nearest tent. Cassandra. She'd drawn a short blade before even fully waking, and I loved her for it. Recognizing my voice, her posture relaxed. Inquisitor, I. No, no, keep your knife. Inquisitor. I may be possessed. She barked a laugh of confusion. What are you talking about? I tried to stop my hands from shaking. A spirit came to me in a dream, offering something that I wanted. And, here only a lie would do, I was unable to drive it away. Cassandra spoke with measured purpose. With all due respect to the terms you and Salas prefer, the Chantry does not recognize a difference between spirits and demons. Which is why I'm here, Cassandra. Now she did look wary. And what happened? Heat washed over me, and I reminded myself that she would not think to imagine a double meaning to my words. It entered my body, there was a merging. She adjusted her grip on the knife, and shame replaced the heat I'd felt. Vivian had been right all along, mages cannot be trusted. I knew I was in the Fade, I recognized that I was not alone, and I let it keep talking. I let myself believe. I accepted the illusion. Creators, I still accepted the illusion as if it were the only truth I'd ever known. But believing in something does not make it real. That night by the Veilfire torch, Salas told me that we must be above suspicion. This had to be dealt with. I am not a Templar, I cannot drive out a demon. This is beyond my power. But you could kill one. She looked sick. We need Cullen. She dressed quickly, then went to my tent so that I could do the same. Without hesitation, she took my staff and cracked it over her knee, the one Blackwell helped me craft. Once dressed, we walked to the edge of camp to find Scout Harding, told her that one of Leliana's ravens had brought an urgent message, that we were bound for Skyhold. We asked her to tell Dorian that it was some political trifle, he and Blackwell needn't rush after us. Cassandra kept watch while I saddled my heart, and we led him down to the road on foot. It was still hours before dawn, the world cool and grey. Will you drink this, Inquisitor? She handed me a small vial, and I knew that it was Magebane before it reached my lips. Chapter 13, The Answer to a Need. It would have been a sight, Cassandra riding a wild hart into Skyhold, the Inquisitor slumped unconscious against her, hands lashed to the pommel. Of course Nightingale's spies preceded us, so when Cassandra took the winding path behind the waterfall and through the dungeon's entrance, Leliana and Cullen were waiting there already. I woke on my knees in the center of a prison just as I had in Haven, only this time I knew exactly what was happening. I was unarmed and unarmored, wearing only the loose shift I'd fallen asleep in the night before. I was bound at the wrists and ankles, my rings and amulets gone. I could bear to part with many things, but I prayed that Cassandra had not destroyed the Sylvanwood ring of Fenharel. 3 of Leliana's operatives stood watch by the door, daggers bare and sworn to silence or death. Josephine had not been called, and I was glad of it. Cullen looked grim, and I could smell the sharp spice of lyrium on him. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, steeling himself for what was to come. Regardless of what happened, When this was over he'd have demons enough to consider. Inquisitor, his voice was steady. A holy smite will drive lesser demons back into the Fade, but those more powerful will fight. In Kirkwall I saw many such abominations. He'd slain many such abominations. If there is no demon, you will be badly injured, and I will beg your forgiveness. Come what may, I would not leave this moment to haunt him. Commander, this is on my order. I looked down, heard the scrape of metal as Cassandra unsheathed her sword, heard Cullen take a calming breath and then a tidal wave of fire and white-hot pain, a ripping and a tearing, and I was skittering across the debris-strewn floor and thrown against the wall. For a moment, nothing, like I had no tie to the Fade, an instant of tranquility, and then it all came rushing back. Searing, screaming, ragged, blinding, pain. Much later, I was dimly aware of drowning in a fluffy human bed. I had no physical strength, no mana. Salas sat beside me on the bed, pressing an elfroot-soaked cloth to my forehead. His wore an expression of cold fury dimmed only by concern. Lethalin, his voice was crystalline. He set the rag aside to stroke his thumb across my brow. Lethalin, what has happened? Salas, I could manage no more than a hoarse whisper. Salas fetched a pot of tea from the fire, and splashed some into a cup. Returning to the bed he took a sip to test it, then slipped a frosted finger into the mug. When it was cool enough to gulp, he held it to my lips and I drank. It was wonderfully bitter, scouring the foul taste from my mouth. Try again, he encouraged. I took a slow breath to calm myself, but failed to meet his gaze. How could I tell this story without confessing the truth of it? Could I bury it in the abstract until he could find no trace of himself in the telling? I dreamed of Haven, as it was before the attack. Peaceful. A spirit appeared to me as a friend. Of course I knew it wasn't him, my keeper taught me the people haven't seen a dream walker in 200 years, but I didn't care. I'd had enough of death and dying all around, and I wanted this one thing for myself. Confusion was written across his face, a question forming, and I raced ahead before he could ask anything at all. It was bliss, peaceful even, but somehow I ruined it. The spirit drew away, told me it was wrong. Are not demons a wish gone wrong? Like the Maganders, bound to a spirit of justice, what if I pulled an innocent spirit from the Fade and corrupted it by my nature? We can't afford another Kirkwall, so I told Cassandra. Salas was terrible in his stillness, a fine layer of frost ghosting across his skin the way it sometimes did in battle. You were exorcised. Yes, I whispered, fearful. He would not forgive me if a spirit had been snuffed out over my foolishness. I heard your screams. Through the stone, through the great hall, through the very veil. You did nothing to protect yourself. No, but Cassandra. Never mind, Salas. The choice was mine, and I am sorry if a spirit was harmed because of it. You will tell me. Cassandra what? There was no eluding him in this. Gave me Magebane. And you drank it. He was incredulous, mouth turned down in horror. I felt nothing but knew he'd sent a tendril of magic to test me, the way I'd once brushed his aura in the woods. You poisoned your own power so the humans might feel safe? So much for the Seeker's great faith, I did not think she would allow the torture of an innocent. You said that we had to be above suspicion, Salas. I had to let them handle it in their own way. It had to happen. This did not have to happen. Now he took up my left hand to examine the anchor, saw the bruises and broken skin where I must have writhed against the ropes. Without so much as a by your leave he jerked back the covers to find the extent of my injury. A short tunic covered my hips, but angry welts around my bare ankles were all too visible, small scrapes and bruises on my thighs. I remembered the force of the smite throwing me across the room. So fearful of an elven child that Commander Cullen could only face you bound and helpless? Too stupid to recognize the difference between an abomination and a goddess? With that sort of discernment it's no wonder the Templars are tearing themselves apart. He was on his feet and actually yelling, thought not at me. Not quite. Hoarfrost was collecting over the tables and chairs, along the banister at the stairs. I'd never seen any mage's power run wild outside of battle, much less one as composed as Salas. Magic isn't a plaything, but the answer to a need. Salas, stop. I didn't even know where to begin, I thought he would be angry for the spirit's sake, but he'd taken things somewhere else altogether. What are you even saying? He took a focusing breath, but could not bring himself to sit. With hands clasped behind his back, he seemed like my Haran once more. Are you more concerned that I would call you a child, or a goddess? You are both. It took centuries to reach adulthood in ancient Arlathan, longer still for their magic to grow. By such standards you are but a babe in arms, and yet you wield the heart of a god, the orb. No demon could possess you. How do you know that, Salas? He dropped gently on the bed beside me, brought my left hand to rest against his cheek. Even with the smite still aching in my bones, it sent a shock through me. Though he'd taken my hand the moment we met, grabbed my neck that once on the battlefield, and traced his thumb across my ear, I'd never touched him for myself. He pressed a gentle kiss into my palm. I am many things, Lethalin, but no demon for wishing to possess you. Chapter 14, each of his words. The world had come to a full stop. He gripped my hand more tightly, as if I would pull it away. His eyes fixed on mine, gauging my reaction as all the little pieces fell into place. Somewhere along the way I remembered to breathe. That is not possible. Salas pressed his face back into the palm of my hand, ran his tongue along the anchor without taking his eyes from mine. It is not possible that I should want you. He bit into the pad at the base of my thumb, or that you are somniary. It was the only thing he could have said to drive my attention away from the first revelation. There are no somniary, I said by rote. This was a universal fact. If a mage could traipse into another's dream, the chantry would have us all tranquil by now. If it were merely possible but rare, there would be stories, whispers. Now he pulled my hand down to the bed between us, uncurling my fingers as if to show me the anchor for the first time. It was still slick where he'd kissed me, and he slid his thumb along my heartline to coax out the muted magic. The anchor flared in sputters of emerald and viridium, weak but well. There are yet somniary in the world, but we are few. We. He always knew how to wield this word to catch me in its wake. He continued massaging my palm, feeding it with his magic since I had none of my own. It is with good reason that Corypheus calls it the anchor, for there's a magic here that tethers us through the fade. I could follow the anchor's pull to find you anywhere in this world or the next, but in your waking dream you followed it to me instead. Then he added softly, I thought you knew. I felt the whole world change, shifting into place and making sense after nothing but confusion. A shimmering thread ran between us, one that couldn't be cut or broken. None of it had been my imagination, but why us? Why does it not bind me to Corypheus? It would be years before I understood how carefully he'd chosen each of his words. When the anchor was new, it was unstable, fluctuating with every expansion of the breach. Killing me. Yes. And I spent a great deal of time by your side, testing you with my magic, trying to keep you alive. It seems the anchor was yet impressionable, and my magic left its mark. And that's why. That is why I have kept my distance. Was that distance I felt between us when you bit my ear? I thought it was C. A heavy door was opened in the distance and I fell silent at the soft scrape of slippers on the staircase. Darling, I heard about what happened. Vivian paused at the top of the stairwell, her disdain clear as she surveyed the dwarven rugs and Ferelden window panes still heavy with frost. How dreadful. There was no telling if she meant my predicament or my quarters. Salas had withdrawn his hands to the safety of his lap, but I was still quite uncovered from where he'd tossed back the bedsheets. Vivian appraised the angry welts on my wrists and feet and sundry bruises, and where Dorian would have made a winking joke she leveled her placid eyes on Salas. Have you been unable to manage a simple healing spell in all this time, my dear? I dare say it would have done her more good than a blizzard. It took no more than an arched eyebrow to cast the spell, bringing healing magic up and around me like a blanket. She sat gingerly on the edge of the bed, avoiding some invisible blight that might stain her gown until she was satisfied that the bruises had resolved. Now, my dear. What are we going to tell them? Salas was having none of it. We might start by telling them that a seeker drugged the Inquisitor and allowed a Templar thug to smite her out of idle curiosity. She looked at him as if he were the most preposterous thing in all of Orlais, then turned her gaze on me. This is why I do not trust him to such a task, and why I am here. She curled her fingers toward her palm to examine her manicured nails with great interest. Can we not conjure some Dalish rite of passage? A harrowing of sorts? There's no one here to contradict us. I am here to. Vivian cut Salas off, declare she passed with flying colors. Vivian, I began. We don't need to bury this with intrigue, we're not in Valroio. No, my darling, sadly we are not. But it is no secret that something dire has happened. I dare say Blackwell has evidenced your broken staff as a sign of foul play. An answer must be given, and we cannot allow others to imagine the Inquisitor consorting with demons in the Fade. It's bad enough she keeps one as a pet. Nor can we suggest that her own advisors feared the possibility enough to follow through with a holy smite. As I said, dreadful. Now she looked at Salas. Believe it or not, apostate, I am as displeased as you to have not been consulted. It would have been simple enough to determine her state of mind. This is the very sort of overreach that the rebels would use to keep the circles disbanded, and none will feel safe if the Inquisitor herself can be falsely accused. She glided back to the stairs, one graceful hand alighting the rail. Now, my dears, put your little heads together and spin some charming elven tale to make this whole mess disappear. Chapter 15, Unequal Measures. Salas retreated from Vivian behind his hermit mask, and he was not quick to let it drop when she left. There were so many loose threads hanging between us, I didn't know which I could use to patch things up and which would unravel us altogether. I tried to appeal to the warmth that had been between us. You bit my ear. He laughed, startled, smiling despite himself. I apologize. What happened was impulsive and ill-considered, and I should not have encouraged it. As simple as that. He was an impenetrable fortress once more, cool and collected. I reached for his cheek, which he'd let me touch only a moment before, but he pulled away. I am not certain this is the best idea. I'm willing to take that chance. Can you not see that is exactly the problem? Despite all my experience in the Fade, I did not realize we were on unequal footing. My desire eclipsed my reason, and Cullen very nearly killed you for it. For my mistake. The memory of the smite felt too fresh to dismiss entirely, but he couldn't shoulder the whole thing alone. I knew it was you, Salas, even when I woke up. It seemed like the greatest truth I'd ever known, but I let fear have the better of me. And I am the one who put you in that position. Then perhaps we should try a different position, I tried to warm him with a smile. Do not diminish what happened with a joke. Here he was acting the Haran once more, wanting me to be an angry Delenn so that I'd lash out and give him further excuse to withdraw. He'd confessed in no uncertain terms that he wanted me, so I would not let him drive me away as easily as he had in the hot spring. You are the one diminishing what happened, Salas. Do you expect me to forget what we shared? Do you imagine that for me it was some moment of passion to be discarded after a moment of pain? I'd take an equal measure of both to be at your side. A shadow crossed his features, the first hint of whatever awful burden he carried. I cannot even promise you an equal measure, Lethalin. This time he didn't pull away when I reached for him, and I took his hand in my own. I wondered if he'd lost a lover in the Blight, if he'd ever taken a wife, if she'd died in childbirth, if she'd been raped by Shemlin, if she'd been killed by highwaymen, something. He must have lived through something terrible to say such a thing. I don't recall asking you to promise me anything, Salas. It was my turn to press a kiss into his palm, and though he once told me not to push him again, I did exactly that. I slid my tongue around the base of his index finger, drew it into my mouth. I gave him one long, hard suck and felt the wall he'd built around us crumble. Now you are the one making promises. When I caught a second finger in my mouth, he laughed and gently reclaimed his hand. Salas kissed my forehead, pushing me back into the nest of pillows and blankets. He laid his hand flat on my chest to hold me down, and bent to whisper in my ear, his voice low. You should be very careful what you promise me, Lethalin. His lips were close enough that I felt the shape of every word. My heart twisted beneath his hand, he'd shot between my legs. Instead of whatever I had hoped for next, he pulled away to sit beside me. But for now I must insist that you rest, time in the Fade will help restore your mana. I have promised to translate an elven text for Danga, but I will remain at your side until you slumber. Despite Vivian's best effort and then this last rush of excitement, I was fighting exhaustion with every breath. Simply pausing to acknowledge it brought the weight of the day crashing down upon me. I settled into my fluffy human bed, marveling that Salas was in it with me, stroking my hair as he had once done in secret. Without any mana, I entered the dark and dreamless sleep of a dwarf. There was no telling how long I slept or when Salas departed, though I was not alone when I awoke. The clink of silver told me that Josephine was setting our little table by the fire, and the smell of roasted beef bones and tomatoes helped to rouse me. The balcony doors had been pulled shut and the sky was dark, but clustered candles kept even the corners of the room warm and bright. Josephine smiled her hello, ducking her head in an informal bow. "Pardon the intrusion, Inquisitor. I hope I have not presumed too much in continuing our tradition. Leliana says that you have been unwell, and I thought you might appreciate a simple repast." It wasn't a diplomatic turn of phrase. Josephine had been told nothing. "I am delighted, Lady Josephine, though you will have to pardon my undress." She gestured to my wardrobe. "If I may." I nodded and she removed the slender pin that held the heavy oak doors, letting them fall open. After a moment of deliberation, what shade of turquoise should an inquisitor wear to dinner after a holy smite? She pulled a lustrous cotton robe from the wardrobe and met me by the bedside. I shrugged it on and stood to my feet, only to have the world swim around me. I hadn't even realized that I'd started to fall until she caught me around the waist and I'd thrown an arm around her shoulder. "Are you quite all right?" "A little weak, but thank you." She helped me to the table, laid with a tureen of soup, a basket of crusty bread, and a dish of fresh butter. The creators must have loved the Shemlens a little to gift them and not us with bread and butter. Josephine brought me up to speed on our latest intelligence regarding the missing Grey Wardens and what little we knew of the trouble in Crestwood. My palm physically itched to close the rifts there, hungry for new magic to replace what I had lost. I'm eager to see the rifts in Crestwood closed. The Wardens can at least fight for themselves. Farmers cannot deal with demons alone, and should the remains of their harvest be lost we may lose the entire region to famine. I agree with your priorities, but perhaps I might persuade the Earl of Redcliffe to send his soldiers in your stead. If you don't mind my saying so, Inquisitor, you do not seem in fighting shape. I could see now that Vivian was right. Some explanation would be required, and it certainly couldn't be the truth. I did not want to mock the creators in an outright lie, but I could think of a few unusual, if superstitious, practices that might warrant my behavior even to a Dalish. "I am not ill, Lady Josephine. While in the Emerald Graves, I performed the last rites for a Dalish first killed in forest and used my staff to light his pyre. I became alas, you would say, ritually unclean. So I broke my staff as an offering to Phalandin, and drained my mana so that Fenharel would not catch my scent. I regret that my duties as a first have caused alarm for the Inquisition." "Oh. Pardon me, Inquisitor, I have never heard you speak so freely of your faith." I smiled. At least this much was true. Unlike Androsta, the creators require no converts. I have little need to speak of them. She paused, a spoonful of soup halfway to her lips. "Have they been appeased by your sacrifice?" Another question I could answer in good faith. Phalandin is a friend of the dead. I've no doubt he accepted my offering at the pyre. Not that he gave a whit for my staff. I tore a chunk of bread from the loaf, spreading the butter with a little knife as Josephine had taught me. She surprised me with another question. "And the other one?" I laughed around my mouthful of bread, held up a napkin and she nodded her approval that I'd remembered to do so. "I fear not. Fenharel is the dread wolf, the betrayer. He is never satisfied, so the Dalish do not sacrifice to him but take measures to avoid his notice." Then I pray that this Fenharel did not, in fact, catch your scent. "You sound positively Dalish, Lady Josephine." She raised her glass in a small toast, and I was relieved to move on. It felt sacrilegious to invoke Fenharel in my own trickery, and I was conscious of my missing Sylvanwood ring. Chapter 16, Festus Bayumo Canavarum. I never thought I would see a blood mage standing in the open, walking the battlements of Skyhold. Varric had all too conveniently managed to omit this particular detail from his tale of the champion. She'd scars up and down her arm, carved in the pattern of ancient runes, and I didn't need to see a smudge of blood across the bridge of her nose to know that she'd worked her magic recently. The air was thick with it, unseen glyphs and wards humming to her will. Not that it bothered me in the slightest. Marian Hawke's allegiance was not in question. She was a known messenger of Ashbelinar. And a ranitician, I greeted her. She cocked one hand on her hip. Well, I suppose I couldn't be Varric's favorite apostate forever. Ah, Hawke, you're still my favorite human apostate. Just doesn't have the same ring to it. Well, it looks like you're still somebody's favorite, he coughed. I thought you were coming alone. Varric nodded to the silver-haired elf leaning against the crenellations behind her. He had one bare foot flat against the stone wall, a relaxed posture that belied the fact he was clearly coiled for a fight. Drained as I was from the smite, the lyrium in his skin called out to me, and I tried to keep my eyes from following the swirling curls of it. Yes, well, Fenris gets grumpy when I run off without him in the middle of the night. To say the least. The last time I was fool enough to allow Hawke from my sight, her brother was conscripted to the Wardens and you discovered red lyrium. Little wolf, indeed. There was an edge of resigned humor to the jab, but it was sharp enough to cut. His voice was unexpectedly deep, elegance and violence twined together in the most alluring way. Wardens and red lyrium turned our conversation to the matters at hand, and we talked at length about what we'd seen with the Red Templars, as well as Corypheus and the missing Wardens. As it turned out, Hawke had a lead in Crestwood, making it all the more imperative for us to set out. I'd have to discuss the logistics with Leliana, but it seemed like the closest thing to a plan we'd had in some time. I glanced at Varric, unsure as to whether we should offer them quarters or whether they'd disappear lest Cassandra find them first, but Hawke interrupted my thoughts. I know we've only just met, she said with a grin, but would it be all right if we held hands? She was looking to the anchor, her curiosity clear. Kman, elf, let's give the girls some time to do some magical shit. Think you could stand to lose a round of Diamondback or two? Fenris cast his eyes around the battlements as if still expecting a trap, then turned to Hawke. He was clearly loath to leave her, his mouth just this side of a snarl. Something wordless passed between them, and his regal features softened. You can try, dwarf, he relented. We won't summon any demons while you're gone, Fenris, I promise. Her voice was blithe. When the two had gone, Hawke stepped closer and I held my left hand between us. The anchor flared to life, though I was disappointed to see it still so weak. If it came to a magical showdown, Hawke would enjoy an easy victory. My mana had only begun to repull. Can you keep a secret? I asked. Apostate's honor, she held up 3 fingers in a salute I didn't recognize. A Templar smited me yesterday, I managed a wan smile. My magic hasn't fully returned. She winced, I'll bear that in mind. Hawke took my hand in hers, sent a pulse of magic out to test it. It's elven, she marveled. So I'm told. How does it work? When we crossed the waking sea, I saw a rift on the storm coast. Demons just spilling out for hours. Fenris and I had our fun, but I couldn't do a damn thing about it. It reminded me of how precious the anchor really was. I'd be entirely defenseless against a rift without it, another charred corpse on the top of a mountain. It's like trying to join 2 magnets by the wrong ends, a violent push and pull. After a time, the force of it seems to flip the rift, turning it inside out, or perhaps fade side in. You can use it to mend the veil, but can you tear it as well? It was a question I'd never even thought to ask. I'd only torn the veil by accident, flailing in the dark and lost from the others after the attack on Haven. I would not have expected a mage without circle or clan training to have such intuition, but then again, Hawke was hardly a mage. I wondered how the Inquisition would have fared if she had been at the conclave as Cassandra had so desperately wanted. Normally, yes, but after yesterday it's little more than a nightlight. Can you keep a secret? She had a downright devious look in her eye. I inclined my head, curious. Then, quick as a wink, she drew out a small dagger and sliced her palm wide open. The blood sprang up, bright and red, and it pooled in her hand without spilling. It was an outrageous thing to do in broad daylight, and then I realized her wards must be shielding the tower from sight, letting eyes slide over us as if no one were here at all. So then it was also a test, to see where I stood on the matter instead of waiting until the heat of battle. I've never done this before. I'll be gentle, she winked. Just ignore the whispers. She'd brokered peace with the Dalish after Maratheri's death, and fought for the people on Sunder Mount. If one were to dabble in blood magic, I suppose there could be no better guide. I touched her aura and felt the blood sing. It was like plunging into a river, an intoxicating torrent of mana. There were whispers, the same as when I cast frost runes, but darker. Seductive. Creators, it would be lovely to listen. I clenched my teeth and pushed past the voices to the raw energy underneath, and suddenly the blood in her palm was a fine mist hanging in the air. When I felt steady, I closed my fist and called on the void. Her blood seemed to vaporize, then a dark point of energy blossomed in the air, a sound like lightning cracking over the boom of a Gotlok cannon. Ropes of green magic whipped from the core, lashing around in search of something to shred. Andraste's flaming panties. Salas called it the mark of the rift, a hole punched into the fade. That it had nothing to devour left me feeling sour and empty, another thing I'd been meaning to talk to Salas about. How the mark seemed to have its own desires and satisfactions, how I had come to think of them as my own. There would be time enough for that, however. We'd be setting out for Crestwood in the morning. Chapter 17, Dirth Ma, Herellen. I couldn't stop thinking about Stroud. Soldiers had died on my orders before, had died the first day Cassandra hauled me out of prison and forced me to decide whether or not we'd take the mountain pass, the day we stormed Redcliffe Castle, the day we closed the breach. But looking a man in the eye and asking him to die for me in the Fade? That was something else entirely. I told myself I chose Stroud because it was a warden mess and a warden should clean it up, but that wasn't true. In the heat of the moment, I thought of Hawk's lover. Varric had told me that he'd left her once, and that she'd spent 3 years waiting for him to return. I imagined her little wolf, waiting the rest of his life and knowing his Hawk would never return. Would I have even cared if he had not been an elf? It was a shite way for the Inquisitor to make a decision. If Stroud were alive, the wardens would have the leadership needed to regroup. If Stroud were alive, the only warden to uncovered Clarel's treachery would be rewarded for his vigilance. If Stroud were alive, the wardens wouldn't be huddled in shame on my very doorstep. Another point of contention, that it was, to my reckoning, the first time I had defied Salas in a decision for the Inquisition, and in mocking my initiative he'd taken to calling me Inquisitor instead of Lethalin. As much as I seemed to crave his approval in all things, I could not agree with him on this matter. The wardens responsible for the chaos were dead. Those who remained were guilty of nothing more than fierce loyalty to the order. They'd been betrayed by those trusted to lead, and I feared in banishment they would become enemies of the Inquisition once more. Salas offered no reasons to justify their exile, only anger. He wanted them punished for their hubris, as if death and nightmares and regret and the calling weren't punishment enough. As if I were offering them husbands and wives and long lives filled with fat children instead of bloodshed and battle. I also kept thinking of that night at the Veilfire Torch, when Salas told me the humans would blame us when they learned that the orb was elven. The more ruthless and unforgiving I made the Inquisition, the less forgiving Thedas would be in return. If a Dalish exiled the Grey Wardens from Orlais, the clans could expect a swift reprisal if the tide ever turned against me. I wouldn't put my people in that position. After Adamant, I'd taken to wandering the battlements at night. Our experience with Nightmare's aspect haunted me still, and demons in the Fade were all too quick to seize upon my weakness. Sleep was a torture, and yet what the Nightmare told me was the least problematic. Poor child, it laughed, Fenharel has caught your scent, and he will steal your every joy. It was as trite a Dalish curse as I'd ever heard, my own grandmother swore with more heat. Instead, it was the poison Nightmare dripped to Salas that I couldn't forget. Dirth Ma, Herellen. Ma Bainalin Azalin. Mar Salas Ena Mardin. The words were under my skin and festering, a wickedly clever riddle cobbled together from transitive verbs with unspoken objects, pronouns that pointed to no one, and homophones with endlessly meaning. I knew that by speaking in Elven Nightmare meant to pique my curiosity, and I was ashamed how easily it worked. Only a Dalish could appreciate the weight of a word like Herellen truly, the rest were of no import. I wondered if it could explain the darkness just below the surface, if it were the reason for the anger and unforgiveness Salas harbored against the Dalish, the reason he'd coax me with one breath and push me away with the next. Had he betrayed someone before? Did he dream of betraying me now? Was Nightmare preying on his potential to do so, or merely my potential to wonder. I told myself it didn't matter, whether he'd done something to earn the title Herr Ellen or not, I was unbound by time. I'd seen Salas die for me in a world gone mad, and I would not let a demon tarnish that memory. A shimmering thread ran between us, one that couldn't be cut or broken. Chapter 18, Binding. However badly I processed the events at Adamant, it was Cole who was coming undone. He'd been beside himself for days, and there was no contenting him. He'd spent the night with me on several occasions, perched on the headboard and whispering frantic prayers or poems that startled me awake. "Cole, sweet Cole, please rest," I begged him. I'd tug him down into the fluffy human bed, cuddling him against me as I'd done for my brothers and sisters. Sometimes he was a squirmy puppy who wouldn't be held, ghosting back and forth between the loft and the balcony, utterly inconsolable. Other times he'd huddle under the blankets with me, letting me kiss his forehead a time or two while I petted his matted blonde hair. I thought of whatever beautiful things I could to distract him: summers along the Minanter Delta, the year I'd learned to swim, everything happy splashes and sunshine and chasing Hala in the muddy shoals. I thought of hunting in the woods at Haven with Salas, the quiet crunch of snow and the peaceful solitude. I thought of attending my older sister in childbirth, holding her hand while she screamed and pushed a new life into the world. For an hour, Cole slept or simply laid quiet, whatever it is spirits do. And then he'd remember Adamant, or stumble upon an unhappy memory of mine, and fly up from the bed. He was wailing and shaking and pacing, fishing up old memories to throw in my face, then begging me to protect him and angry that I wouldn't do blood magic for him. It was entirely unintelligible. I slipped down the stairs and through the great hall, into the room where Salas lived and breathed. We hadn't spoken much since the business about the wardens. He was still angry, but Cole needed him. I sat on the pallet where he'd made his bed, afraid to wake him. He was engrossed somewhere in the fade, but I didn't know how to seek him out to wake him from the inside. I touched his shoulder. "Salas." He didn't flinch, so I shook him gently by the shoulders. His eyes were flickering beneath their lids. I cupped his face in my hand, rubbed his cheek with my thumb. "Salas." A muscle twitched along his jaw, and I knew he was fighting to the surface. I bent down to him, whispering in his ear so as not to rouse the whole tower. "Haran, please wake up, something's terribly wrong with Cole. I need you." He reached for me, one hand warm on my neck and sleepy eyes lingering where my tunic billowed open above him. He had a soft, unguarded look as he woke. "Lethalin," he whispered, as if he hadn't been angry with me for days, as if this thing between us weren't smothered and buried and half forgotten. "Where is Cole?" he asked. I couldn't help but take him by the hand, leading him to my chambers where we found Cole pacing frantically along the balcony rail. I wrapped myself in a blanket and curled up on the settee by the stairs. Salas could handle things from here. I had no skill beyond babying Cole like a little brother, but Salas could reach out to him in a more spiritual way. They argued out on the balcony for a while, and I hadn't realized that I'd drifted off to sleep until Cole was shouting again. "It isn't abuse if I ask." "Not always true." Salas was stern, calm. I blinked, trying to orient myself to the conversation, when Cole materialized beside me, tugging on the hem of my tunic and pleading. "He won't bind me. He's a mage and he likes demons, but he won't help. You played blood mage with the hawk, you ate from the palm of her hand, but you won't help me. Why won't you help me?" I was not awake enough to deal with this. Salas turned toward me, his expression incredulous. "Creators." I tried to focus on the issue at hand. "Cole, why would you want either of us to bind you?" "So I'm safe. If you won't do the ritual to bind me, someone else could, will. Like the warden mages, and then I'm not me anymore. Walls around what I want, blocking, bleeding, making me a monster. A mage using blood magic could conceivably do that to any one of us, human or demon. You should ask Salas to bind you too." Now it was my turn for an incredulous stare, and Salas unabashedly held my gaze a moment before turning back to Cole. "Cole, we will solve this. I know of a Rivani amulet that may be of some use, though we will need time to find it. Until then, you must stay calm, no good can come of your panic." Cole seemed to shrink in on himself in relief. At last something had appeased him. Chapter 19, Faith, Not Revenge. The journey to Red Cliff was awkward to say the least. Varric stumbled in when we tried to activate the amulet for Cole, then insisted on chaperoning us into town as if he might change Salas' mind en route. While they debated, Cole murmured to himself without ceasing, a steady stream of worries and fears that wore at us along the way. I walked alongside him, tried taking his hand in mine, but he was too agitated to stand the touch. He melted a few paces away, chanting closer, closer, so close softy to himself. With the crossroads and prying ears behind us, Varric turned his charm on me. For all the goodwill between us, he was sorely mistaken if he thought a Dalish mage would take a dwarf's advice on matters of the Fade. It's not that I didn't value his opinion, but I wouldn't presume to advise him on how he should handle Bianca. He'd shrugged off his duster and slung it over his shoulder, enjoying the day's unseasonable warmth. Don't you think it's important that Cole chose to be a person? If he wanted to be more like a spirit, he wouldn't have left the Fade. Shouldn't we at least have the decency to respect his decision? I didn't even have a chance to reply before Salas chimed in. Tell me, child of the stone, did you know that the champion practiced blood magic with Lavalan? Does that mean we should respect the Inquisitor's choice to open a vein in battle? That worked out so well for the last Dalish mage you befriended. Shit, chuckles. His expression went dark. Varric didn't often turn serious, but when he did he managed dead serious better than anyone. Don't make me your straw man. I've never once cut myself. Tell me you didn't consume the mana in Hawk's blood. We're talking about Cole, Salas, not me. There is no reason we cannot discuss both, Inquisitor. I think all here are interested. Oh, boy. I did, but... Then you've already taken the most difficult step, Salas sounded smug. Maker's breath, boots, isn't that what lyrium's for? Yes, well, I turned to Varric but aimed my words at Salas. Lyrium requires a mage to have some mana to begin with, which is a little tricky to manage after a smite. Or perhaps Salas would have preferred that I skulk through Crestwood without a spell to my name. Wait, wah. But Salas was back in the fray. What I would prefer is for the Inquisitor to focus on her duties, not her desires. Oh, is that a topic up for discussion now? Because I've been meaning to ask about this whole binding. You killed me. Just up the road, Cole was about to slit a man's throat. You forgot. You locked me in the dungeon in the spire, and you forgot, and I died in the dark. My stomach lurched. Creators, this was how he was pulled from the Fade? Cole was yelling, hatred and anger contorting his voice as I'd never heard before. It was everything I could do not to immolate the man where he stood. Salas sprinted ahead, all else forgotten. Cole, stop. The man took his chance and scrambled to his feet, tripping over himself as he ran. Cole stalked after the man, raving mad, but Varric cut him off. I killed people all the time. I even sat by while my friends killed people for fun. It was a favorite pastime for Syrah. I'd seen Cole slip a knife between the ribs of men and women alike, showing no more emotion than a firm but good-natured, goodbye. I'd never heard anything like this. There was no doubt in my mind that the man was guilty, but something was different. Cole was different, like he'd run out of compassion and could only come up with hate. His story spilled out, about the first Cole, and there was no sense in even pretending that I wouldn't cry. It was awful. It was everything I hated about the Shemlin circles and Templars, the unending cruelty they heaped on free mages. Apostates, as they called us. Cole's voice turned hard, and he spoke of a need for killing. He'd never needed that before. Killing had always been incidental to Cole, collateral along the road to helping. I remembered what Salas told me, that a demon was a wish gone wrong, and for a moment the hatred in Cole's voice was so sharp I thought he'd grown into a shade before our eyes. But he remained, reedy and thin and starting down the path after the escaped Templar. I looked to Salas, didn't have to say the words. He followed after Cole while Varric and I remained in an uncomfortable silence. He was seething. I knelt in the grass, scratching a little wart into the dirt, a simple rune I'd learned as a child. So let me get this straight, Boots. You're down with blood magic, but not a little old-fashioned revenge? Makes sense to me. Knife-eared bitches are a copper a dozen, what I do isn't important. Thedas has enough vengeful humans, would you truly sacrifice the light and coal to give it one more? He gave me a weary smile, put a hand on my shoulder. Maybe letting the kid grow wouldn't have snuffed anything out. Maybe it would have been a puff of air to fan the flames so he could burn brighter. Or maybe I'm a Nug's uncle. But at least I know why you keep losing at Wicked Grace. You don't know the value of your own hand. He ambled off toward the crossroads, and I didn't follow after. Chapter 20, Shake the Dreams. In what seemed like non-stop commotion since Hawk's visit, I had barely spoken to Cassandra, much less found an opportunity to ask her about my Sylvanwood ring. In truth, I'd given up on recovering it after the smite. Cassandra would have returned it by now if she had the power to do so. Yet I held out some small hope that to her it was such a trifling elven thing that it slipped her notice. Perhaps she'd tucked it into a pocket or drawer somewhere. I thought I might find her in the Bailey practicing footwork with Lorinal. The Dalish had warriors, but none like Cassandra, and so he often joined her to pick up new techniques. The rest of his clan had finally come to Skyhold, and while Haon had begun casting spelled glass for the windows, Ithiron had shorn his Hala. I'd sent some of Cullen's men off to Jader for a loom, and soon enough true Dalish banners would hang in the Great Hall. Today, I found Cassandra alone, landing blows on a straw dummy. "Where's your elven apprentice, Seeker?" She lodged her sword into the dummy's neck, then swept out her arm to point toward a section of our crumbling battlements. "He is with the others today, repairing the tower wall." "Joining stones without mortar is a specialty of the Dalish," I told her. "Quick work too, we can't afford to invest much time in our camps, but their protection is essential. If that is the case, perhaps you might convince them to move their work indoors." Hallway to the war table. "One of these days, a clumsy servant will stumble right out of the keep." I laughed, but she was right. The hallway was still cluttered with debris, and a small pile of rubble was all that stood between the walls of Skyhold and a 100-foot drop. "Speaking of my Dalish eccentricities, I wanted to ask you about a ring of mine. I was wearing it before," I trailed off, but she followed my meaning. "Anyhow, it's not important really, but I thought perhaps you might still have it." Cassandra tossed her practice sword aside, walked a little closer, consternation on her face. "Salas did not give it to you." "What?" "Danya examined your effects, destroyed anything enchanted just to be safe. But she said the ring held no magic, so I gave it to Salas. I thought you might prefer it in the keeping of another elf, and I did not think it would slip his mind." "I did not think so either," I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Inquisitor, I apologize. I should have seen to this matter myself." No, Cassandra. It's quite all right, I'll speak to Salas. He has been rather preoccupied as of late." "Thank you." I turned to leave, but she caught my elbow. "We haven't talked about before. I wanted to thank you. None would have ever suspected, and yet you told us anyway. I pray the Maker will grant me that same courage should I ever doubt myself." It caught me off guard, and for a moment I had no reply. The whole mess was entirely the fault of my own doubt, not courage, and I knew now it was nothing to be proud of. Yet to Cassandra, I truly faced a demon and put my life in her hands. She would not forget it. The silence stretched another heartbeat, and she gave me a little bow. "I will say no more of it. But if you are able, have a word with Cullen. It troubles him still." I nodded to her, dread already building up in me. "Thank you, Cassandra, I'll do that." I wasn't ready to be alone with Cullen, even flanked by Josephine and Leliana at the war table. The sight of him brought a rising panic in my chest. Just knowing the true extent of his power. I could close rifts, fight Corypheus, and call on the void itself, but a Templar could strip it all away with a gesture. It was no wonder the rebel mages fought as they did. I pushed it aside. I did not want Cullen to dwell on this, but for now I could not face it myself. Instead, I had the curious task of retrieving my ring from Salas. He had little regard for Dalish custom, even less for Dalish religion. While I believed he'd relish an opportunity to correct the error of my superstitious ways, I hadn't imagined he'd go so far as to withhold something that belonged to me. As expected, Salas was in his study, huddled in a chair that would have been oversized even for a human. He looked pallid and miserable, dark under eye circles exaggerating his years. It was something of a shock. Yesterday had been a triumph. Salas had given Cole peace, pushing him closer to the spiritual ideal of compassion. What had changed in so short a time? He sipped from a hammered tin mug, grimacing. Something wrong with your tea? It is tea, I detest the stuff, he snapped. But this morning I need to shake the dreams from my mind. I may also need a favor. Another surprise for the day, Salas was not a man to call in favors. The ring could wait. You just have to ask. He jumped to his feet, began pacing. One of my oldest friends has been captured by mages, forced into slavery. I heard the cry for help as I slept. Finethus, no wonder he looked so awful. There could be no peace waking up to that sort of burden. Yet somewhere, in my most irrational depths, jealousy pinched at me. Salas visited others in the Fade, but not me. Not since. A summoning circle, then. Yes, most likely. Iron Bull and Blackwool, I think. You and I have enough magic to manage the disruption, but it will take brute force to upturn the stones. His eyes narrowed. You've done this before? I've broken a summoning circle before, yes. But thank you for implying that I've bound spirits to my will. I kept my tone light. I wasn't angry that a man like Salas would worry. When you spend your life roaming the free marches, you're bound to stumble on an apostate or two doing something naughty. I apologize, I should not have. It's all right, Salas. I would be blind with anger if something like this should happen to a friend. We'll go at once. He closed the distance between us, and my heart stopped. In an instant, his hands grazed around my waist and he held me close enough that I could feel his wolf bone amulet pressing into the fabric between my breasts. He bent to touch his forehead to mine, the Dalish equivalent of a hug. I hesitated a moment, then let my hands come to rest on his hips. Thank you, he breathed. There was an energy between us no less potent than when we had embraced in the Fade, and the anchor flared in response. It lasted only a second, but time seemed to stretch the way it often did in a focused battle. I let myself revel in the warmth of his breath on my face, the sweet smell of dawn lotus and embryum, and the hum of his aura coming so close to my own. I pulled away, lest he think I would repurpose his grief for myself. We'll leave at once. Check the description for the links to the author.